Hey everybody, thank you so much for clicking on this video. Today we are going to talk all about exercise modifications. We're also going to ignore the laundry in the background because I am too lazy to put it away. So most people think that modifications are simply an easier form of a specific exercise. And while that's true, there's also a lot of other reasons you might take a modification that isn't even necessarily about making the exercise easier. So today we're going to break down 8 examples of why you might take a modification and what that actually looks like in action. First modification you might take is if the exercise is too hard. This is what people typically think of when we think of modifications. And this is a great idea because you want to make sure that you're nailing your form, feeling it in all the right places, and reducing the risk of injury. Let's take the example of a Copenhagen plank. In a Copenhagen, you're elevating a leg on a bench or a box to recruit a lot of adductor and overall pelvic stability. But this is an incredibly challenging plank variation. So if your body is not ready for that amount of force, you're going to want to take a modification. Really simply, I would just choose a side plank instead. You're still going to feel a lot of the same muscles working, but with less intensity than the full Copenhagen. And this doesn't make it a worse exercise by any means. It makes it an exercise that meets you where you're at. I even talk about sometimes in my own classes that on my left side, I'll take a modification by placing the knee down in my side plank because my left ankle, it's where I had surgery on. I have different flare-ups sometimes, so it doesn't always like that full side plank. Again, it doesn't mean that I'm not getting anything out of the exercise. It just means that I'm meeting my body where it's at that day. So let's say you have an exercise programmed at a machine, but that machine is currently being occupied at the gym. I think you've got 2 options here. You can come back later, or you can just sub in a different exercise. If you sub in a new exercise, I'm gonna recommend that you not only utilize a similar piece of equipment, but also make sure that you're performing in the same movement pattern. Let's use a lat pull down as an example. So if you don't wanna wait and come back later, I'd either go for a seated lat pull down on the floor, utilizing a different part of the cable machine, or you can do a single arm lat pull down from a kneeling position. With either of these options, you're still doing a vertical pull at a cable machine. Your base is just a little bit different. Now, this also means that you might not be able to move as much weight, but training doesn't always have to be about that. And if your training is specifically about that, then I would actually just wait for the machine to open up and do the exercise programmed. Now, let's say that an exercise is inaccessible to you. This is actually something that happens with me every once in a while with the current programming that I'm on. The program that I'm on is written for the masses. That's not just specific to me. So sometimes I need to sub in another exercise because I can't do it. And by I can't do it, it either means that it's not feasible in the space that I have, or it doesn't feel right on my body with the equipment. Let's look at an example so you understand what I'm talking about. This actually happened to me last week. I had a superset of a half kneeling single arm landmine press and a bench supported row. Doing landmine work is always a little bit of a pain at my gym because there's no great place to set it up. And a bench supported row requires a wild amount of setup for me because I'm so short. So instead of taking 10 to 15 minutes to try to find all the equipment I need in a space that makes sense in my gym, I'm honestly just gonna sub the exercises out for 2 things that work in the same movement patterns and utilize similar equipment. So I'm gonna take that landmine press and make it a half kneeling single arm overhead press. It's still a vertical push and it's still a unilateral variation. I'm gonna take the bench supported row and make it a single arm bench supported row. It's still a horizontal pull, it's unilateral, but it's still very supported, so I can really load it up still. And situations like this are really important for me to educate my clients, you guys, on how to navigate, because the last thing I want you to do or feel is like helpless in a situation like this. I want you to have the basic understanding of how to make changes in the moment, smart choices in the moment, and finish your workouts feeling strong. All right, so let's say you're working out at home and you have limited equipment, so whatever exercise you're supposed to be doing just isn't super challenging. There are 2 main ways that I would tackle this. Change the variation of the exercise or change the tempo. So let's take an RDL, for example. Let's say you're at home and you just don't have super heavy weight to challenge yourself enough in your RDLs. You could try unilateral variation, like doing a single leg deadlift, a rear foot elevated deadlift, a kickstand deadlift. Because we're working now primarily 1 leg at a time, you're not gonna need as heavy weight to still be working in that hip dominant exercise. Now let's take an example of a squat. Let's say you're supposed to be doing really heavy front squats, but again, you don't have adequate weight to challenge yourself there. You could try my second tip, which is changing the tempo. So instead of going down for 2, up for 2, you can go down for 3, pause at the bottom, up for 1. I talk about this a lot in my virtual classes because I understand that people don't have a limited equipment at home, so I'm meeting people where they're at. I'm giving people a plethora of choices and educating them along the way to make the best choices for them based off of their equipment, their goals, and their needs. It's just gonna give you a lot more ownership over how you execute exercises and meet the prescribed intensity of your workout for the day. Now let's say that there's an exercise programmed that you just fucking hate. There's a handful of exercises that I really despise, but there is one one that I will never do. A barbell hip thrust. If this isn't a program, I'm changing it. Hear me out. I'm about 5 feet tall, so finding the right bench for me, I can't even use a bench. I have to find a box, right? Then I have to go find an open wall where I can press the box up again so I'm not sliding around. Then I have to go get an unloaded barbell. Then I have to add adequate load, and for a hip thrust, you can load these up pretty darn heavy. Just for the time that it takes to do all of that, I just find it's a very overrated exercise. Now, if you have a hip thrust machine at your gym, that's completely different. You go for it. I would probably go for it if I actually had access to that. Now, let's say it's programmed and you're like me and you're just like, oh, I'm not doing that. What can you do instead? It honestly depends on your program, but if I'm just looking to work in the same movement pattern, I'm just gonna choose another exercise that works the glutes in the shortened position. Maybe a single leg hip thrust or some type of bridge. But to be honest, if this is like a heavy load day, like working max strength, I'm probably just gonna choose a deadlift instead, as long as I'm not seeing those in the rest of my programming during the week. And that's another thing to think about. Zoom out and look at your full program for the week and see kind of like what else you're hitting and what else you could sub in that you just enjoy a lot more, that's similar enough. Again, a deadlift is different. You're still working the glutes, but you're gonna be working them in the lengthened position. So it is a little bit different, but in my opinion, it's similar enough. And most of us are not training for like optimization. We're just like training to be strong and look a little bit better. I would personally rather work on a skill that I enjoy than suffer through something that I hate the entire time. Now, let's say you have a mobility limitation that restricts a certain exercise. This is another time that I would just choose something else that works in a similar movement pattern. For example, let's say you're limited in shoulder flexion, but you have an overhead press in your program. There's a few options here. If you've got an incline bench, you could incline bench. You're basically taking out a little bit of the angle so you can still work that vertical push without compensating through the ribs or pelvis to get more range of motion. And if you don't have access to a bench like that, I would try a side leaning 90-90 press. This variation opens up the angle of the shoulder to allow, again, a vertical push without any compensations. And the added bonus, you're gonna get a little hip mobility work in here too. Now, let's say you're in a workout and you come across an exercise where you don't know how to perform that skill. If you've taken class with me, you know that I love a kettlebell swing, but let's say you've never done it before, you're just not super confident in it. Well, let's rewind, break down what we're working on in a kettlebell swing, and then select another exercise from there. So a kettlebell swing works explosive hip extension. What's another exercise that works hip extension? A deadlift. So you could do a tempo or a power deadlift to get a similar stimulus. If your weight isn't super challenging for a deadlift, you could always do a single leg variation, or maybe you work on a goblet clean. There's not one right answer with these things. It's really gonna come down to thinking about what's programmed, what equipment you have, and then what you want out of it. Our final modification here has to do with missing equipment. So let's say you're in one of my workouts at home and we're doing step ups, but the only thing you have is a chair that isn't step up ready. Honestly, I would just say do a lunge instead. Is it perfect and exactly the same? No, but it's still a unilateral exercise that requires stability, hip flexion and extension, movement in the sagittal plane, and you can load that bad boy up. So I think the biggest takeaway from this video is to remember that in most cases, we're not going for perfect or optimal with our workouts. We're going for confident, complete movement. Most of us, myself included, are general population, and that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean that we don't train with intensity. It just means that we don't need to follow every step of a program written exactly as is, because the stakes are way lower. We're not athletes. Best thing you can do for yourself is follow a program, modify as needed, and make sure you're enjoying most of it along the way. If you have any specific questions about modifications, leave it down below. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out, and I will see you all in the next one.